Good morning. I'm Wilfred Brimley, and I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about diabetes. Actually, about diabetes and how it's affected me in my life. I'll start when I was first diagnosed. Diabetes. I was scared to death. I was experiencing symptoms that were strange and unfamiliar to me. For instance, I had an unquenchable thirst. My tongue felt like a horseshoe rasp. I was losing my vision. I was losing my energy. I was getting up every 15 or 20 minutes all through the night. So I wasn't getting any rest.
Oh, I say it again. You've been had. You've been took. You've been hoodwinked. Bamboozled. Led astray. Run amok. This is what it is.
You've been had. And what makes matters worse is you're allowing it. A lifetime of nutritional deception has forced us into the fight for our lives. We are the plant-based Riot. We are here to tear down that curtain of secrecy created by our very own American food industry. A plant-based diet and a disease-free life are not out of reach. Make the choice. I think we're pretty primed here. All right, guys.
We need to get some. Do you have any whiskey that we can put in here? It's like
Irish water,
Irish coffee.
That's awesome. All right, so here we go. Wow, guys! First episode in the podcast studio in the garden. How about that? We're gonna wait till we hear some clicking happening here. We're about to get started. The plane is taxiing down the runway.
Keep talking.
And we're about to rotate and
gyrate,
pull up wheels, and
okay, you're good.
And head full steam here. Welcome, everybody. We are at the Plant-Based Riot podcast booth. Make sure to come by and visit sometime up here in Sierra Madre. We're in the garden, and it is 5 a.m., and it is 49 degrees here, guys. So there's no leaf blowers, no planes, no
disgruntled neighbors.
Yes, it's actually quiet. All we actually can hear, if we listen for 1 second. That is not Mike. That's actually the garden. We have some watercress going with the pumps, so we hear that. That's super nice. Wow, it is quiet and it is cold, but when we were bundled up, we got the coffee. So today's episode, Diameates. What a pain in the pancreas. Pancreas. If anybody wants to write into us to help that pun work out good, we'll make that word, pancreas. Diameates. It ain't just sugar's fault. All right, guys. So today, a couple questions for you, both Brian and Mike. Is there an association between eating animal products and chronic disease?
Mike, go for it.
Yes, absolutely there is. I would say that consuming a lot of meat, dairy, and eggs, having both saturated fats and, oh my God.
Even eggs, though, right?
Yeah, eggs are high in saturated fat. Meat, especially from corn-fed animals, is high in saturated fat. It's high in omega-6 fatty acids. It has a tendency to lead to diabetes.
I want to figure that out because this is new to me. I always thought it was sugar.
Right?
I mean, can you get diabetes from eating meat?
Yeah, most people think that sugar is the culprit. Unfortunately, sugar is kind of the after effect or the after product of developing diabetes. So elevated blood glucose kind of comes later down the continuum. So most animal products essentially are all the same. I know we've had this conversation talking about how the marketing industry gets a hold of beef as a product, or chicken as a product, or eggs as a product, and they try to outsell the other industries, right? So eat eggs, don't eat chicken. Eat chicken, don't eat beef. Eat beef, don't eat pork. But essentially, all these animal products are the same to the body because they all contain some essential elements that are toxic to the body. So whether it's milk, eggs, or the flesh of an animal, it contains generally they contain high levels of protein, excessive protein levels. As Mike said, saturated fats, cholesterol is another one. Some of them are high in iron, and iron, as we talked about on previous shows, are highly reactive to free radicals. Also, high levels of iron are detrimental to beta cells, which produce insulin, which is another mechanism that leads to diabetes. Some of them are high in sodium. So sodium is constantly associated with high blood pressure. And then the other one would be sulfur. So sulfur-containing amino acids, such as methionine. Some of these animal products are high in that protein, which are also associated to beta cell failure and the development of cancer. So, yeah, so all these things that are elevated in animal products are all associated with the development of both diabetes and obesity. So,
again, something else I was never told in school. Completely new to me. We want to thank Whisper Farms. Whisper Farms is a co-op of backyard farms and gardens providing fruits and vegetables at the Atwater Village Farmers Market. Come and check him out with our one and only, the garden guru, Mike Wood. Mike, what's going on this time of the year? We're in mid-January. What's going on at the market right now?
Well, we've got onion sprouts that are recently returned to the market, backed by popular demand.
Yes.
They are so delicious, very oniony, crunchy. They make a great topping to salad or sandwich.
Wow.
They're beautiful, little green sprouty onions.
Little sprouty onions. I like that. All right, guys, we are the Plant-Based Riot, a weekly commutable length, evidence-based call to action conversation about what living a healthy and disease-free life. Follow us on Instagram at Plant-Based Riot. I'm Dan Farnham, cameraman, father of 3, doing the whole plant-based vegan household for 3 years now, and I teamed up with a couple other Sierra Madre dads to do the podcast here. And we got Mike.
Hey there, I'm Mike. I'm a stay-at-home dad. I'm a vegetable vendor at the Atwater Village Farmers Market, and I am a grower at home. So I grow fruits and veggies. And that's my deal. Oh my God.
He grows a lot, guys. He's downplaying this. He is like the master of the backyard garden. People come to him, documentaries come to him, other podcasters and YouTubers come to him.
do you want to put a plug for that documentary that you just did
Oh,
on YouTube?
sure.
That 2-hour thing that happened?
Oh yeah. So my good friend John Kohler came to visit me and checked out the garden, and it's been a lot about trying to share what I've learned about hydroponics, and to try and dispel a lot of myths about hydroponics, and basically the joy of being able to grow a lot of food in a small area. What works for me?
Less water.
With 90% less water, yes.
Yeah, you guys have to watch it. It was very cute watching the bromance between these guys develop on the YouTube channel. It was very intimate. They shared a moment.
And over here is Mr.
I'm not aware of that.
Dr. Brian K. Blackburn.
I'm Brian. I'm a metabolic scientist. I've been insane for that romaine for the last 23 years.
He's insane.
And I recently welcomed a 3rd child to the family.
Wow,
got another member, and sleep is gone, and we're just trying to increase our coffee consumption and get through the day.
Wow. Amen. So today's episode, Diameates. Guys, we're just going to jump right into this because I've got a lot of questions. And like I said, I thought diabetes was a glucose, insulin, sugar thing. And I'm realizing that those are just markers at the end. And this wasn't the beginning of the train of the situation here. So back me up. I, of course, know nothing. I don't come from the metabolic world. I'm only a few months into this garden world. So I really don't know much in this. So my question to you guys to kick this off is, define diabetes and how did it occur? Like, start me off. Diabetes 101.
So diabetes is probably one of the most horrific diseases to kind of poke its head out in the last 100 years. It is a metabolic disorder that impacts every system in the body. It's generally is induced with the development of obesity. So those two things kind of go hand in hand and overlap. And it's a multi-system disease that is characterized primarily by an increase in a chronic increase in blood glucose levels, where you start to leave the 90 milligram per deciliter level and start to exceed into levels of 300 and 400 milligrams per deciliter. So as I said before, glucose or sugar consumption is not necessarily the cause of it, but it's the hallmark of the disease that develops later on. It's an indicator that the disease is present.
And that's what we can control. Is that the part that everybody's trying to control?
That's the part everyone's trying to control, because once you develop a resistance to insulin, which we'll talk about later, blood glucose levels start to increase to superphysiological levels. And then there's all these diabetic associated complications that come with the development of that hyperglycemia. So, and it's a really slow burn. So the development of the disease, it takes about 10 to 15 years to fully mature. So one of the markers that they look at is blood glucose levels, because we can start to see that over the development of diabetes, which they call the continuum. There is a slow and steady increase of blood sugar levels, and that's a basal blood sugar level, like before you even eat or consume any food. So before you even eat, those sugar levels are already high, and then once you consume food, especially food that's high in glucose or sugar, those blood glucose levels are going to increase even more. So
if I'm on a low carb diet, but I'm eating a lot of protein and fat,
yes,
could that give me high levels of sugar in my blood?
Well, if you're on a high protein diet, you're going to probably have lower blood glucose levels. Protein is going to stimulate insulin to a little bit less of a degree than sugar would. But if you are eating macronutrients that are absent of carbohydrates, your body's going to produce sugar another way, and it's usually through protein degradation, or it's going to use stored sugar that is known as glycogen that's in the liver and in the skeletal muscles. It's going to start spitting that back into the blood to keep that blood glucose level at about 90 to 100 milligrams per deciliter. So your body wants to keep blood glucose within a very, very narrow margin. Mm-hmm. So it'll either secrete glucose from stored sources, or it'll break it down to keep it at within that margin. So it tries really hard to not let it go what we call hypoglycemic, where it's too low, and it tries really hard to not let it go hyperglycemic, where it's too high.
What about if I'm eating a high fat diet, like a keto diet? Yeah,
so
could that lead to a rise in blood sugar?
Generally, a keto diet is going to lead to an increase in ketone development, which is a substitute for blood sugar, right? So in individuals that are diabetic and they have high levels of blood sugar, and that sugar can't get into the cells where it needs to go, they start developing ketones, because ketones can act as like a kind of surrogate fuel for sugar. Mm-hmm. Yeah. At the end of the day, you don't want any of that stuff to happen. Uh-huh. Yeah. So, yeah.
So it seems like there's multiple ways that you can get diabetes, not just from eating too many carbs.
No, it's not. It's not necessarily the carbs. It's excessive macronutrients that lead to the development of obesity, which then leads to the development of insulin resistance, which then leads to the development of these other things associated with diabetes.
You know, the other day I was looking at the cause of like kidney failure.
Yes.
And you know, having type 2 diabetes is one of the factors that leads to kidney failure.
Yes.
And our kidneys are like these filter organs.
Yes.
They're constantly trying to clean out what we're eating.
Yeah, especially from the blood.
From the blood, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, you see all these commercials on TV about dialysis.
Yes.
You know, like, and the DaVita organization constantly catering to people who have kidney failure.
They're making billions. Yes. Yes, they're everywhere.
And it just seems to me that, you know, we've got a nation of people who are consuming an excess of what of what they don't necessarily need.
Yeah, and it's
Too much protein, too much fat, too much carb.
Yes, it's all very unstable, and we're not following any guidelines. People are just kind of bouncing back and forth from this diet to that diet to whatever the hot new trend is. But yeah, kidney failure is a real thing. It's a horrific byproduct of diabetes. And, once that goes, you're sitting in dialysis 4 times a week, 7 hours a day, and that's your life.
You can't come back from that, can you?
You can get, donors and you can replace it. Wow. But yeah, there's I'm going to go back to my physiology and anatomy. I believe in the kidney, you have this filter. It's called like the Bowman's capsule. And it's like a screen, right? So imagine like a screen door that keeps all the insects out and things like that. In the kidney, you have a very similar function. You have a very similar device that kind of filters things out. So it keeps very large proteins like albumin and red blood cells. It keeps it out of the kidney, and it just kind of extracts like micronutrients and water and things like that, metabolites, waste, and that's what gets into the urine. But once the kidney starts to fail because of destruction, then that screen door starts to kind of get tears in it, and then you start to see bigger proteins get into your urine then you start peeing blood, and you start to see things in the urine that shouldn't be there. So that's a sign of kidney damage.
Ain't no fast food worth the kidneys, man. That's crazy.
And that's unfortunately when people get to that point,
it's too late.
It's too late, and they're like, okay, I got to stop this diet, and it's like, well, you should have stopped it a couple of years ago, because now you got to deal with all the side effects of this disease. So.
It seems so dangerous how diet fads are like a pendulum swinging from one side to another.
Yep.
One time you have people saying sugar is the culprit,
yep.
and then people start to go on a low carb diet,
yep.
and then they start to eat extreme or excessive amounts of proteins and fats,
yes.
and then that can be just as damaging to the kidneys as too much sugar.
So. As I mentioned when we started the episode, these animal product industries, right? The milk industry, cheese industry, beef industry, they're all trying to compete for your dollar, and the diet industry is no different, right?
Amazing.
So they're trying to compete for your dollar as well, and buy their products and buy their books and buy their apps and buy, follow the ketogenic diet, follow the CrossFit diet, the paleo diet, the caveman diet, and again, they don't care about your health. They don't care about your wellness. They're just after your dollar. And that's where, if you're going to start looking into these changes in diet, you need to look towards the medical journals and see what they're finding, because we're unbiased. We have to go through a very rigorous evaluation process when we publish something, where a committee of specialists have to look at what we publish and look at our data, and they have to grant us permission to publish something. So it goes through very stringent evaluation processes, and we're not doing it to make money. We're doing it to say, okay, well, based upon the science that we have, this is what that diet is doing, or this is what this product is doing.
So, Mike, in the history of diabetes, I'm trying to trace this back just to get a timeline going. I'm seeing this indication. What is the green revolution? I thought the green revolution was just everybody eating plants in the past 5 years. That's not the green revolution.
No, so the green revolution is something that happened after World War II. So think about turning tanks into tractors, bombs into fertilizer. So, some of the same ingredients used to make bombs can be used as a fertilizer, such as ammonium nitrate. Can't currently buy that on the market anymore because, that's dangerous. But, with the Green Revolution, you're talking about the implementation of technologies like inexpensive and widely available fertilizers, mechanization of grain production. You're talking about plant breeding in order to get high-yielding crops like wheat and corn and soybeans. You're talking about irrigation projects and dam building so that we can have widespread use of
hot damn.
You're talking about greening the desert, fertilizing parts of the western United States that were dry as a bone. Now we've got dams, we've dammed up the rivers, and we can We can irrigate lands that have been dry for centuries. And so you've got this insane amount of production happening in the 50s and 60s of grains. So you get cheap grain, you get cheap meat. When you have cheap meat, you have the rise of fast food. And so we have a fast food nation. That's a great book by Eric Schlosser, where he talks about slaughterhouses trucking in migrant laborers to process the meats for these fast food chains. And then you've got a full-scale health crisis on your hands as a result.
And Brian, that timeline correlates with data found about the onset?
Yeah, so the Green Revolution kind of supplied it was the driving force behind the availability of these products, right? So, and it really kind of changed our diet. If you look at data from collected from like the agriculture industry, you can see that from like 1960 to 1985, like we had a massive spike in both meat production and meat consumption,
which is the 10 to 15 years after all this ended, right?
No, it was as Mike was saying, in the 50s and 60s. That's when this kind of started to happen, this Green Revolution, and in alongside with it, the increase in the production of meat and the availability of meat, and not only meat, the egg industry and everything else, made it more readily available for us, and it made it cheaper. So, we had access to more of these products, and we started consuming more of it. And I do have multiple papers I'll put on the show notes that can show you this data. I'm not going to go into the details of it.
No?
But, yeah, I mean, we could talk for like 45 minutes on these details.
I love it.
But yeah, so essentially from like the 1960 to 1985, we see that there's just a massive increase in red meat production and consumption, chicken consumption, cheese production and consumption. And I'm talking about like five-fold increases in consumption of these things, yogurt consumption. And, right around 1985, into like 1995, within that 10-year span, we started seeing a major increase in cases of diabetes. And as I said earlier, diabetes is kind of a slow burn. It takes a long time to develop, and we really didn't understand the disease until, well, I can't even say more recently, because we're still trying to figure out the disease. It impacts everything. But we did see that, about 10 years after this major increase in production and consumption, we started seeing more and more and more cases of diabetes. So there is an absolute correlation and connection between the Green Revolution, the development of cheap grain, the development of cheap feed for animals, the increase in animal consumption, and then the increase of this metabolic disease pandemically across the world.
At the time, this was being done with good intentions. It was about increasing the availability of food, what was considered to be high quality food.
It just seemed like the wrong food.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of what happens a lot in medicine is, you look back and you're like, whoops, we didn't know as much as we thought we did.
I mean, it's something that happened out of prosperity.
Right.
Despite our best efforts
Yeah.
to do the best that we could using the best technology available, we ended up creating a massive problem that we just couldn't have seen.
Well, speaking of problem, if you guys want to come back and drop something else, just a few facts that I've been able to pull up here. Currently, the American Diabetes Association reports 26 million children and adults in the U.S. have diabetes. This is every year, 1.9 million Americans are diagnosed with diabetes. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's diagnosed.
How many are undiagnosed?
There's millions that are undiagnosed because, like I said, it takes a long time for the disease to develop. And now we're starting to look at more biomarkers as an indicator of like, okay, well, this could possibly mean that there's some sort of pre-diabetes happening here.
Mike,
Right, so 79 million Americans have what is known as pre-diabetes.
Right.
And that's that's coming close to a third of Americans. And 7 million in the U.S. have an undiagnosed condition of diabetes type 2.
And what's really scary about this is, I think the last graph I looked at, I believe that China and Brazil are taking the lead in the diabetes pandemic. So this isn't even including other countries. And I know I've been sending a lot of video guys to you guys.
We get it. Brian gives us this awesome. He digs deep in these weekly diabetic videos, which is great. But I'm like, I don't know what I'm looking at it anymore.
Interestingly, right now, because of China's population growth, right? They have 9 million people, and they're having a hard time utilizing the land there to create enough food to feed the people. So now Chinese investors are purchasing American companies. So, now Smithfields, they just bought Smithfields for billions. It's a pork producing company in Ohio, one of the.
We'll find that out.
Right. And so they bought this company, and now they're shipping pork back over to China to help feed the people. And then I just sent another video to you guys last night about the California dairy industry, which is essentially bankrupt right now. And now China is starting to have a taste for milk, which historically they never drank, right?
Wait, now because I took that as I understand that the California almond industry is at a peak right now.
Right.
Because of awareness, maybe. And now what's going on? Is that is there a shift that's happening?
I think there could be. I can't say for certain. This is a screwy state, so when places go bankrupt, I have to first assume that it's might have something to do with the way the states run. But I don't know if people are more aware, which could be a possibility. But now the Chinese investors are coming over to save the California dairy industry to start sending more milk over to China. So the point I'm trying to make is this is a really good example to see how the Western diet and the way that we eat might impact China and exacerbate their already existing, condition with diabetes and cancer over there.
The Western diet is becoming the worldwide diet.
We're gonna see that their cases of diabetes are probably gonna skyrocket because of their desire for the type of food that we produce here. So
they're going to want fresh greens and gardens soon. Is that the idea?
I think to the rescue. So that was something I was thinking about when Mike was talking. Is if the green revolution was truly green, right? Because I think
right?
I think it's an interesting thing that they called it the green revolution when it was
should have
the
called
opposite.
it the seed revolution, because that's what it's all about. Is seeds.
But what fueled the revolution is mechanization, right?
Right.
And
cheap
that's
fertilizer, cheap oil,
right? That's
cheap
not very
energy.
grassroots. That's not very green, right? But I was wondering what the state of this country would be if it was truly green. If we said, okay, we're going to start raising, lush fields of cabbage and kale and Italian kale and Brussels sprouts rather than meat, dairy, cheese. I wonder what kind of place we would be at in as far as our health if that role was reversed. So that made me really.
We probably wouldn't have a podcast.
We wouldn't have. Yeah, the farm companies, the pharmaceutical companies probably wouldn't be as rich and as powerful as they are, and would we have as many doctors and specialists? If you're a kidney specialist in medicine, diabetes is fueling your career.
Your house in Beverly Hills and in Hawaii and in Europe.
It really is,
Japan. What's interesting is the Green Revolution is considered the third agricultural revolution, right? So this is a process of agriculture morphing itself and reinventing itself about every few generations. And so,
are we about due?
Absolutely, we are. I think America is currently going through a transition into a new green revolution.
But it's a de-evolution this time. It seems like it's going more grassroots.
It's like an intentional production of leafy greens.
Yeah,
it's like a riot.
I like that plug.
It's becoming a revolution simply to grow food in small spaces in areas that are not necessarily considered farming areas. It's this idea that the supermarket is a place of death. It's a place of disease.
Yeah, it really is. It is. That's an interesting spin on it. Yeah. But the commercials we see on TV, they won't tell us that. They'll show us pictures of sunny farms with happy animals and the green revolution and how efficient it has been. I sent you guys another thing. Resulted in essentially us creating 300 tons. Wait, what was it? 300 million tons. 300 million tons of animal products a year.
Oh my God.
Remember, I sent you guys that website with the graph. So if that's the product, 300 million tons, what does the byproduct of 300 million tons look like? And you were just telling us that story in Montana, right? Where they're
right. So, dairy farmers and cattle ranchers, but especially dairy farmers where they have confined animals. It's a common practice to just shovel or dump, scrape the ground, like a cement floor.
Yep.
Into rivers, and that's like just as a way to get rid of the manure because it's out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
This is the way
It's like not
my
in my
grandfather
backyard
did it.
sort of thing.
Yes, it's like it's a crazy way to get rid of waste, but it's hugely damaging. If you talk about nutrients that are being dumped into aquatic ecosystems.
Yeah.
Speaking of damaging, earlier you mentioned the type 2. I'm aware of type 1 and type 2, but can you guys just kind of separate those and explain? Just
Type 1 is congenital or is something that you're typically born with, and type 2 is something that is typically adult onset, but it can happen as early as
meaning by what
late
you're eating. Is that you get
diet related. Yeah.
diet? So type 2 is diet related.
Yeah, so type 1 is an autoimmune disorder, which means that your immune system basically attacks a tissue, or it attacks a hormone that a tissue is secreting. So essentially, your immune system recognizes the pancreas or the beta cells as something that shouldn't be there. So it's an invader, and it attacks that and starts destroying the beta cells, which then means you have a very low production of insulin, and then that means that you won't develop insulin at all over the course of time. Generally through inflammation, it destroys that tissue, and the tissue can't function anymore. So then you're on insulin the rest of your life because you can't produce it anymore. So that is genetic generally. However, if you guys, there's a book called The Devil in the Milk. Fantastic book that talks about certain amino acids in milk that are associated with autoimmune disorders such as type 1 diabetes. Very, very good stuff. It's written by a scientist, but he does a really good job in putting it into lay people's terms. So there are some articles out there, excuse me, in research that show that autoimmune disorders might be a result of milk consumption.
Wow. So type 2 then?
So type 2 then is adult onset or type 2 diabetes, which is we do it to ourselves.
That's happening in one human lifetime, whereas type 1 is kind of like a crossover from one. It's like a hereditary disorder that could very well be diet related
or genetic related, right? Where type 2 is completely self-inflicted. So it's something that we're developing through too many calories, too little activity, sedentary lifestyle, diets high in saturated fat, diet high in cholesterol,
high in everything,
high in all the no-nos, right?
Okay, so but the takeaway for this would be exercise and eat your greens. Is that what that means? Like, what could I do to avoid type 2?
Absolutely, the same thing we've been
everything.
The same thing we've been saying for
plant-based
years.
diet, high fiber diet, or I should say, eat plants in moderation.
Exercise and diet. Start cooking for yourself. Start buying your own food. Stop going to fast foods. Stop
farmers market.
Yeah.
The easiest way to not overconsume macronutrients is to have a plant-based diet, because if you eat mostly plants, you're eating a fiber-rich diet, and that's going to slow you down. It's going to fill you up.
Yep.
It's going to give you sustained energy throughout the day. And
generally, plants are not calorically dense, right? So there's a term called calorie dense or calorie density. So, if you eat, you go buy a cheeseburger from somewhere, let's say that's 700 calories, and you just have one cheeseburger. 700 calories in steamed broccoli, you could eat bowls of it all day and not get to 700 calories, right? So it's less calorically dense than the cheeseburger, so you can eat more of it, thereby increasing more fiber, increasing more vitamins, increasing more minerals, increasing more of those, anti-carcinogenic polyphenols and things like that. So, the development of type 2 diabetes is a choice. There are genetic factors that are associated with the development of it, and I mentioned this in a previous episode where, the genes are the gun and the lifestyle is the bullet. So if you want to live a lifestyle that isn't as healthy, then you're loading that gun. You're basically giving the genes the fuel they need to turn things on or turn things off that lead to the development of type 2 diabetes.
So before I ask you guys about insulin and glucose, refresh me. I think this may have been said, but I can't answer it for myself right now. So how does, back to the topic, how does meat, in a very brief way, how does meat, I'm trying to get to insulin and glucose, how does meat open up that doorway for diabetes, like in a quick abbreviated thing? Like,
okay, so how is it the culprit for developing? Okay, so there are several schools of thought on how animal products can induce diabetes, and it's all mechanistically. Now, there are thousands of mechanisms that we're evaluating with the cause of diabetes, but if we look specifically at meat, or dairy, or our cheese, or our eggs, generally the way it induces insulin resistance is through either saturated fats or inflammation or both.
In excess.
In excess. So when you eat an excess amount of saturated fats, you create something called dyslipidemia, which means there's a lot of lipids, a lot of fats floating around in the circulation. And as you become more resistant to insulin, that increases, because when the cells can't get the sugar that they need to help create energy, then the adipose tissue or the fat cells starts to secrete more fat, because that's the primary fuel that the cells are going to use to create energy.
And then how does that relate to insulin?
So,
and glucose?
So inflammation, high levels of inflammation have been shown to inhibit a protein in the cell called IRS1. And IRS1, essentially,
I've heard of KRS1. That's
he's a
I'm
good
dating
rapper.
myself here.
Boop, boop. That's the sound of the police. That guy.
I think so, right? That's all I knew.
So IRS1, basically, to not get into too much technical stuff here.
I'll stop you, but go.
Yeah. So when the insulin receptor turns on, right? When insulin is floating through the blood and it needs to turn the receptor on, the first protein to be activated once the receptor on is called IRS1. And IRS1 is going to basically phosphorylate these other proteins in the cell to let glucose get in. So once you have high levels of inflammation, that inhibits that IRS1 protein from being phosphorylated. So now it can't communicate with the other proteins to let sugar in. So so inflammation stops that protein and that cascade from happening.
And what's what causes the inflammation in this point?
Just eating foods high in saturated fat.
Okay.
Not even just saturated fat. They're, omega-6 fatty acids are also associated with high levels of inflammation. So if you're getting too much of that,
Grain-fed animals.
right?
And what's inflamed?
Tissues.
Your body tissues, muscle tissues?
Yeah. So it depends on where the tissue's at. You'll secrete cytokines, you'll secrete adipokines. It depends where the inflammation's at, but not to get too far into it. Another one is so not just inflammation, but when you have a high level of fat consumption and that fat is getting into the cells, it creates long chain fatty acids in the cells. It creates elevations in triacylglycerols in the cells, and it also generates more of these things called ceramides and DAG, which is diacylglycerol. So the more fat you eat, the more of these things are created in the cell, and both ceramides and diacylglycerol have also been shown to inhibit insulin signaling. So the mechanisms of how fat and saturated fat impact glucose and insulin is through this inhibiting of these signalings in the cell that allows glucose to get into the cell.
Got it. So briefly.
Absolutely.
Insulin is what, and glucose is what?
So glucose is the sugar that we obtain from food, right? So glucose is basically, it's created two ways. We get it through food, foods that are, carbohydrates, potatoes, bread, pasta, buckwheat, things like that. The sugars are extracted, put into the bloodstream, and then those sugars are then sent to either the liver or sent to tissues that need sugar for creating energy. So insulin, what was it?
The other one was insulin.
Okay,
so that's glucose. What is insulin?
Yeah, so then insulin is the hormone that is released from the pancreas, and it senses sugar in the blood because when sugar gets into the hepatic portal vein and gets into the blood, concentrations of that glucose will get into the pancreas, and then it acts as like a sensor. So the pancreas says, okay, well, we have this much sugar in the blood, so let's secrete this much insulin to help get the sugar where it needs to go.
Well, that makes sense. Earlier you said pancreas is one of the first things to go when you have diabetes.
So when the pancreas interacts with high levels of glucose, right, because the glucose is circulating through the blood or you're consuming high levels of sugar in your diet, when that interacts with high levels of glucose all the time, it's detrimental to the cells. And it creates byproducts in there called free radicals, and free radicals can damage those cells as well. And the pancreas has very little defense against these things. So then what happens is when glucose levels, as I said, when they start to get high and elevated, it starts to destroy those cells because they don't have much protection against high levels of glucose.
So this is why diabetes is a pain in my creass.
Your pain, yes. So to put that all together, the consumption of these products, animal products, so let me just kind of review all this, leads to high levels of saturated fat, leads to inflammation. I told you the two mechanisms that, 2 out of 1,000, that basically show how fat and inflammation can inhibit insulin signaling. Okay, so, and it does it within the cell. And then once this happens, once there's an inhibition of insulin signaling, then insulin resistance starts to develop. And that means that basically the insulin can't do its job to get the sugar into the cell because the tissues are becoming resistant to it. All right, so it's very, very complicated stuff. And
thank you for explaining.
Yeah,
that was pretty simple. So then you're saying that can you contract diabetes through eating junk food? Describe how that happens, even if it isn't quote unquote junk food. But
it seems to me that you're basically over consuming macronutrients. And then your pancreas is constantly pumping out insulin to compensate for the elevated levels of glucose in your blood, and eventually it gets burned out from it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It not only does it get burnt out, but the beta cells start to die. They start to perish.
And where beta
those
cells?
are in the pancreas. So the first thing that happens is when there's this overcompensation where the insulin's not working anymore, the beta cells start to push out more insulin, and when that happens, they start to go through a phase of hypertrophy, so they get bigger, right? So they're developing more insulin. Yeah, they're developing more insulin. They're shipping more insulin out, and then the insulin's not doing the job, and at the same time, glucose levels are rising because the insulin's not doing its job. So then eventually the beta cells start to perish, and no insulin is produced at all, and then you're getting on insulin from the doctor. Then he's like, okay, I got to put you on insulin. So, and then, as I said earlier, when we're eating that junk food or we're eating, these animal products, the mechanisms with the fat and the inflammation are what's causing the resistance to insulin in the first place. So then the pancreas reacts and says, okay, we got to push out more insulin because for some reason the insulin's not letting the sugar in at a specific tissue, right? So, so in it, it's interesting because there's a snapshot of how diet, and you could probably talk more about the green revolution here. If we look to some studies done in Japan in the 60s, before 1960, the prevalence of type 2 diabetes in Japan was like 1 to 3% nationwide, right? Because at that time their diet consisted of complex carbohydrates, lots of soy, lots
Blue zone kind of thing.
Yes,
right?
it's very, very blue zone. And they did eat meat. They ate fish, but very small quantities of it. They weren't, what do they call it at In-N-Out? Double. Right? They weren't doubling up on the.
They weren't doing a 4x4.
Yeah, you do 4x4.
Is that a real thing?
It's a real. I've never done it, but it's a real thing.
Okay, so don't eat a 4x4.
4 patties
and save your damn kidneys.
Piggy style. So put bacon on that 4x4.
So they weren't doing the 4x4, and before 1960s, like I said, 1 to 3% diabetes, and that was over the age of 40. So that's when as we get older, it's easier to develop. So then you go through this green revolution. We start introducing some fast food into Japan. We start to see like more McDonald's and 7-Elevens and
Kobe beef.
Cheeses, dairy products. And then if you look at 1980 to 1990 in Japan, the rate of diabetes went up to 15 to 20%. So over the course of 10 years, 15 years, it's skyrocketed, right? And that was with the introduction of our diet and our foods. And now if you look at the Japanese diet that was essentially once a blue zone, they're kind of following the same diabetic continuum that the rest of the world is, because now that food is a staple there.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It seems like you kind of get sucked into overconsumption of meat because, a lot of people love meat, and for most of humanity, meat has been expensive and difficult to raise. But once it becomes cheap and easy to get, it's this highly addictive thing. It's like making a cake has become cheap. Making, a burger and fries has become cheap. And people are stuck and addicted to it because it's just so available. It's so easy to get.
It's funny. It feels like we're in the future now, right? It feels like we're sending things to Mars. We're doing the moon thing again, and then you look at this, you're like, wow, these topics are very middle-aged kind of topics we're dealing with currently, right?
Yeah,
this is crazy.
It's just something that we haven't paid attention to
ever.
Right? And that's when I go and do talks with people or presentations, I always tell them that you have to evaluate your diet the same way you evaluate your checkbook, the same way you're going to do research when you go buy a car, right? You're not just going to walk into a dealer and be like, yeah, I'll take that car.
I've never done that. Growing up, I'm not reading things. I don't know where anything comes from.
So my parents kind of always made me do that, and I appreciate it now. If you're putting away from your retirement, right, you wouldn't push it aside and say, I'll deal with it in 10 years. At this age right now, we're all kind of thinking about, okay, how do I start putting money away and making the right decisions to, have something when I retire, if retirement's a thing anymore. But you have to give diet the same respect you would anything else.
If not
more, right? And it maybe even more because we're so far behind the curve with our understanding of it, right?
So if I'm not saving for retirement, I shouldn't necessarily be eating this way because in theory I would live less. Is that a correlation somebody could make?
If you're not saving for retirement, you shouldn't be eating which way? Healthy?
I should.
Oh yeah, you should go the other way so you get the clock out earlier.
Live it up, right?
Yeah, exactly. So go get a 4x4.
All right, I'll be right back.
So yeah, people, and even science, we're so far behind the curve. Like I said, mechanistically, we're starting to figure out how high consumption of fats are inducing inflammation. And like one of the things that we see is high consumption of saturated fat induces something called TNF alpha, and that creates inflammation all over the tissue. So it's a transcription factor that basically tells the DNA to create cytokines and inflammatory responses.
Not the show Alf.
I love that show. Whoa! Wait, what was that guy's name?
I'm trying to think of the
Louis
dad.
or the dad? Eddie? Oh, Eddie! Whoa!
It's good. Wow.
Where's the cat?
Sorry.
So,
KRS-One, we're back.
Whoop whoop. I love that guy. That's the sound of the police. Okay.
You'll hear that on our intro today, guys.
So, we're just.
I almost got him.
We're just now starting to understand these things, and we're just so far behind the curve.
It feels like it.
We really are.
It's unbelievable. I always thought that diabetes was caused by sugar. And we're always told to don't let your kids eat all the sugar. Take away all the sugary snacks. But why is there a big alarm on sugar and not on meat? Like specifically, what associates sugar with diabetes, and why aren't we associating meat with diabetes now?
So sugar is
Food
the
marketing.
easy. Yeah, I was gonna say it's the easy target.
It looks pretty, right? Yep.
Well, so to clarify, sugar, we shouldn't be eating high amounts of sugar in the first place, because with high amounts of sugar, you're going to have high spikes in insulin, right?
Okay.
And one thing we don't want is we don't want insulin turned on all day long, right?
Regardless of whatever we're
Right,
eating.
because when insulin is on all day long, that's another mechanism where the tissue starts to become resistant to it, right? So we
and
don't
inflamed.
Possibly, yeah. So I mean, if the beta cells are spitting out insulin all day long, you could have an inflammatory response from that. So, and that's another thing that's so difficult about the disease is it can develop from anywhere, right? It can develop from within inside the cell. It can develop at the beta cell. It can develop at the liver. So one thing that insulin does to the liver is it shuts off glucose production. So while you're sleeping at night, your liver is what's keeping your brain alive because it's secreting glucose that's stored as glycogen. When you eat and insulin turns on, that has a negative feedback response to the liver, so it shuts the liver off because essentially you're bringing in sugar from the diet. So you don't want the liver contributing to the sugar from the food at the same time. So insulin plays multiple roles in this whole process, and you could develop resistance to insulin at the liver or at the adipose tissue, at the fat cells, or so it can happen anywhere. And so if you're eating high levels of sugar, you could have a long insulin response. All right, and if it's just
Like a spike.
if it's processed sugar, you have a massive spike and a massive plummet of insulin. If you're eating that sugar all day long, you will have a massive spike and then maybe a slower decrease in insulin. So you don't want to have sugar all day long, because then insulin's on all day long, and that can lead to resistance to insulin.
So like if you're eating a high carb diet or
Yep.
lots of sugary foods, causes a spike in glucose, leading to a crash, which leads you to be hungry again. So you eat
Yes.
something else that's high in
Yes.
sugar.
Yes.
And so by doing that, you're constantly spiking and crashing, which leads to
That crash is hypoglycemia as a result of massive amounts of insulin being pushed into the blood. So that's absolutely right. Yeah.
So if you're eating, a cup of beans a day,
Yeah.
high in fiber,
Yep.
you've got sort of a steady amount of energy throughout the day.
Yeah, and the more complex the food, right? So we generally don't tend to eat things by itself, right? Okay, so let's say we had like popcorn, right? We don't eat anything else with popcorn. We just take handfuls of popcorn. Popcorn is going to have an insulin spike, right? Because it's a very simple sugar. It's a starch. If we had popcorn with, let's say,
Baked broccoli.
baked broccoli, right? That sounds good. That is going to slow down the insulin response, because now you're mixing the sugar with other macronutrients and other
Fibers.
fiber, right? So it's going to have a slower response to insulin, which is better for the body. So sugar has always kind of been the easy target. And now we're looking at how sugar is the byproduct. And that's why I told you those mechanisms earlier, where an increase in obesity, an increase in inflammation, an increase in dyslipidemia, an increase in saturated fat consumption, an increase in cholesterol consumption, all these things are responsible for initiating insulin resistance. And then the sugar, the elevation in sugar, is the response to that initiation. So once the inducers of insulin resistance start to happen, then we start to see the climb in blood glucose. And of course, when you go to the doctor, the first thing they want to do is just hit you with more insulin. So they'll give you prescriptions where you have a fast responding insulin, you have a slow responding insulin, and then you'll have one that you take overnight where the insulin's being slowly put into the bloodstream so that it can regulate that blood sugar. Because like I said, we want to keep our blood sugar within a very narrow margin. And essentially,
And that's so expensive. I mean, our healthcare costs so expensive.
Yeah, and
It just dawned on me, like with the Green Revolution and then the rise of cheap food, it has given rise to a very, very expensive healthcare system.
Right.
And that's not saving anyone money.
Right. The economics of diabetes is trying to solve. No, it's trying to control diabetes, not prevent it.
Yeah. So all the medication out there is control it, slow it down, right?
Because that's how you can't
Right.
make money on telling people not to eat this stuff.
Right. So can you reverse insulin resistance? 100%. You can do it through diet. You can do it through exercise. And I have a couple of studies I'll share with you guys really quick here to show you how people who have diabetes have done that. But
you can actually stop it, prevent it, slow it down. Like this is what this study is about.
yeah, so let me look at these really quick. So a couple of different studies that basically took people with severe type 2 diabetes, and the details of these papers I'll upload on our show notes as well. One study looked at two groups of diabetics that were pretty far along the diabetic continuum, and they put them on a program where they basically, one group was not allowed to have any animal products and they had to minimize their oil. And the other group of diabetics, they were put on a isocaloric diet, which means that they basically reduced their calories. They had a little bit of monitoring by the group that conducted this study. And they ran this study for about 14 weeks. They weren't allowed to exercise either. And the diabetics that were on the vegan plant-based diet, they essentially lost about 15 pounds over 14 weeks. 3 to 5 inches in their waist circumference decreased. They had significant increase in insulin sensitivity, and a lot of them got off their medications. So in 14 weeks, they basically...
That sounds like a cure to me.
Right. They reduced diabetes with no meat at all. Also, their HbA1c plummeted. They went from like an 8.7 to a 6.8 over 14 weeks. So they went from a very high, dangerous level of HbA1c to almost a normal range. And that's without exercise. So if this group was allowed to exercise, you would see these numbers drop even further.
I'm kind of guilty at that right now. It's been the past few years. I haven't been going to the gym. I've done this, and all of these indicators and markers have plummeted.
Yeah.
But like, I need to.
Yeah.
Last year's goal was to step up the exercise game, so maybe this year's goal is to step up.
It'll accelerate all these things.
Maybe if I stop drinking chips and beer, that would probably be a good start.
Yeah, so you might want to start there.
Okay.
That same group, that vegan group, that over the 14 weeks, they also dropped LDL significantly. So their low density lipids significantly decreased, where the other group that wasn't vegan and were on an isocaloric diet, they had a little bit of a drop, but it wasn't significant. There's another group that did a study for 4 weeks, and they looked at how a plant-based diet reduced severe type 2 diabetes. Essentially, they took two groups, they split them up. One group had to be on a strict plant-based diet. The other one was on another isocaloric diet. And the group that was on a plant-based diet, they had severe reductions in total cholesterol, total LDL, total triglycerides. They had significant weight loss. They had significant decrease in inflammatory markers, right? So as we said, inflammation is one of the things that induces insulin resistance. So if you get rid of the inflammation, you become more sensitive to insulin. And then by that happening, blood glucose starts to drop because it can get to where it needs to go.
So it's never too late. Our bodies are amazing. Is that what you're saying? Like,
yeah, I mean, this one was 4 weeks. 4 weeks, everything drops significantly.
So no matter who you are, you try this and you will see things. You will see change.
Yeah.
It's cool.
And then just one last study, same thing they did. This one was a vegetarian diet, not vegan.
So that means they're still eating dairy.
Still eating eggs, possibly dairy. I'll have to get the inflammation. I'll have to get the information on that study, and I can post it. But a vegetarian diet, so a little less aggressive than a vegan diet, right? So if anyone's listening and wants to kind of maybe wean their way to a vegan diet, this is proof right here in the pudding.
Dairy-free pudding.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of vegetarian diets are pretty heavy in dairy eggs and refined grain bread.
Yeah, which is a problem. I've been meeting a lot.
Diameates.
I've been meeting a lot of vegetarians who are morbidly obese, and then when I ask them about their diet, like, oh, I still eat a lot of cheese and dairy, and okay, well that makes sense because that's so and again,
high in saturated
it's
fat.
It's high in these fats, right? And it
doesn't seem to make sense if you call yourself vegetarian. It's really I think it should be its own category.
Yeah, like kind of
like
its own entity.
You should call it. You should call yourself a lacto ovarian.
Yeah, and they do. They have all those names for it, right? All those different.
I want that shirt.
But nix the vegetable.
Yeah.
Because that's.
Yeah, that's true. Because they're not eating.
I don't think you should be able to call yourself vegetarian if 90% of your diet is eggs, cheese, and bread.
So the study your bread.
Yeah. So the people that were on the vegetarian diet versus the traditional diet.
Meaning American diet, traditional diet.
Like they're still eating meat, and they actually had a significant reduction in weight, significant reduction in waist circumference, significant reduction in visceral and subcutaneous fat. And then also they became much more respondent, sensitive to insulin, and also glucose. Their glucose tolerance increased. So just by reducing their diet of a little bit of animal products, right? They just shaved off a little bit. They had all this benefit in health, right? And especially the most important is their response to insulin sensitivity and glucose tolerance, which means that by reducing a lot of the saturated fat, they increased their sensitivity to insulin, and as a result to that, glucose could get into the cell and go where it needs to go. So they had a reduction in blood glucose levels. So, and that was over 24 weeks. So 24 weeks is a long time. If they went vegan, it would probably be a lot quicker. So the point I'm trying to make is there's so many more studies coming up now on plant-based diet because people are starting to pay attention. They're starting to see that it is the cure for a quick reversal, even faster than medication, right? So as we said earlier, medication will control and slow the development down. This shit is reversing it like within weeks.
That's amazing.
Within weeks. But where are the TV ads? Where are the billion-dollar TV ads to say, hey, do this instead of, taking this medication and having all these side effects? And
but where's the money?
Exactly.
You're going to put a lot of people out of work.
Because the green revolution has already put the system in place. Right. It's already there. And now
what's crazy is that so many farm animals, if you want to talk about factory chickens, cows, and pigs, they're getting chronic illness. Did you know that it's pretty common for a chicken to get congestive heart failure?
No.
And these are the animals that we're eating, and we ourselves are getting the same conditions. So like we're raising animals on basically an excess of grain because that's what's cheap, and then we're eating an excess of these animals that are dying of disease. They have, you could have chickens that are just about ready to die of heart disease.
Yeah.
And then they're going to your plate.
And a lot of these slaughterhouses, they look like prisons, right? Like they have guards, in the tower, they have barbed wire fence. They don't want people in there. They don't want people seeing it. They don't want people, knowing how it functions. They don't want people to see the low wage labor that's in there working. Some of these places are saying, okay,
sedentary lifestyle of the farm animals.
Yeah, like, some of these places are saying, okay, well, we have an open door policy. Come in and see how clean our facility is, and they'll put a lot of effort into cleaning the facility. But what you just said is like, okay, well, I want to look at the animal. I want to look at the quality of the physiology of that animal. Are they healthy? No. And now I wonder, like, if you're on a high grain diet and that's all you're eating, right? And why are they doing these? Why are they putting these animals on high grain diets? Because
it's cheap.
And what does it do to their?
It makes them grow faster.
Right.
And get fat.
It makes them grow fat, and then you get that nice marbling in that steak, right? So when people get that steak that has that beautiful, like you said, Kobe beef, right? That's so expensive because it's perfectly marbled, which that's fat. That's all saturated fat. That's fat of the animal. So if these animals are getting bigger and fatter, and as I said, in humans, with the development of obesity, we have the development of type 2 diabetes. They overlap. I'm curious, what is
one feedlot going to? It's an animal feedlot going to a human feedlot.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm curious, like, if these animals are developing diabetes, and I'm going to look into that. I'm going to read into that and see, and we're going to talk about that on the next episode. Is like, okay,
I would say they probably get slaughtered before
it can develop. Yeah, because
develops.
it can, yeah, that's a good point, because their lifespan is what?
Pre-diabetes.
Yeah.
Lifespan of a chicken is like 12 to 16 weeks.
Okay.
But for a typical dairy cow, it might be 2 years. Like the Amish are raising a dairy cow for sometimes 20 to 22 years. But
so they're going to
factory cows are about 2 years old.
Wow.
Before they become hamburger. And by the time they're age 2, their bodies are just about ready to give up.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So the ultimate cost, what does diabetes cost us? I found this on the CDC, same thing as on the diabetes.com. Check this out, you guys. This is what blew my mind. This is from CDC, the average medical expenditure for people with diagnosed diabetes is about $16,750 per year, of which about $9,600 is due to diabetes. The medical expenditures of people with diabetes is approximately 2.3 times higher than expected cost if they did not have diabetes.
Wow.
$16,000 per year? That's a lot of gardens, my friends.
Yeah.
I mean, so now the question is, it's cheap, isn't it? It's expensive to go to the farmers markets. It's like, well, wait a second, not at $16,000 per year.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's insane.
It's an easy fix. It's an easy alternative, to take that money and spend it elsewhere.
Nobody can afford that. I want to say the majority of Americans can't afford that. So
now it's taxpayers, right?
If we really want a socialized healthcare system, we're gonna have to up our game. We're gonna have to
we're eating.
We're gonna have to change the way we eat. Otherwise, nobody is gonna be able to afford this.
Yep.
Unbelievable. It's disrespectful on so many levels to yourself and to the country. Right? Is this not?
Right.
You could trace it that way.
Yeah, we're all paying for it. We're all paying for it through tax dollars, and it's bankrupting us.
Yeah, and it's, as I said, with that, it's big business. And with China, exporting all of these products over there now, you're going to see an explosion over there. And what follows that? The farm companies, the dialysis companies.
DaVita.
Yeah, all the ways that we manage this disease, they're going to expand. And they're going to get to go out there and make more money. And that 300 million tons of animal products that we're creating a year now is going to go up to 600 million tons, because we're not stopping, right? I mean,
have you ever seen WALL-E?
No.
That Disney film,
no,
WALL-E?
No.
That's the end goal.
Okay.
That we're headed towards. People spending their lives in a hover chair, getting a liquid slurry of pizza and milkshake.
And you know what? It's funny. I see it because we received a good friend of mine had given us one of those Amazon Alexa things for Christmas. What are those things called? Amazon.
Alexa,
yeah.
Dot.
Yeah. So now I'm just like, it has these options to turn on things in the house. So of course I set it up and I'm like, like Alexa, turn on the lamp. And I'm like, I never have to get up again. Like technologies. I tell my son, I'm like, you get me a beer. Alexa, turn on the lamp. like my daughter, bring me something else. Like, I never have to move. This is fantastic. But the point I'm trying to make is that
we're evolving into a sitting creature.
Yes, exactly. From a hunter and gatherer to like a just sitting stagnant creature. And then to just kind of talk about the ultimate cost of this disease. It is a slow, painful disease that will develop. It will impact every tissue in your body. Excuse me. And it will
even your throat.
Yeah, it will ultimately end in death. And there's
damn.
Yeah, my throat.
Sounds true though.
It's associated with cardiovascular disease, as we said earlier, kidney disease, diseases of the nerves, the neurons, eyesight, pregnancy complications, inflammation of the gums, so oral complications, microvascular complications, changes in blood pH level, which lead to other complications, thickening of the blood, ketone generation, gout. You develop gout. You have the inability to heal wounds. You can get diabetic foot, Alzheimer's disease, stroke, cancer. It's all related to diabetes. So as I mentioned earlier, those are the response to diabetes. So you have
Sounds like rapid aging.
Yeah, it is. It's an acceleration of age, and it's all because of the sugar elevating, right? Not the sugar's the problem. Yes, it could be a problem, as I said earlier, but it seems to be that, if we eliminate these meat products, we reduce the inflammation, we reduce the fat that's circulating. As I showed you with those studies, all this stuff kind of goes away, right? And some of these studies were as fast as 4 weeks. Some of them were as long as 24 weeks. So the reduction is there. And then Dan, do you want to talk about your
so I've been going,
eyesight?
Just ironically, everybody,
ironically.
Yeah, thank you. It's been 3 years I've been eating the greens here, and last year and this year, my vision. This kind of thing occurs, of course, in real non-plant eating life as well. But my vision has gone back down. It's been getting better, back to back, to the point of I'm at half a point better now in both eyes.
Yep.
And I would say you're probably eating more vitamin A in your diet. If you're eating more greens and vegetables, probably getting a lot more vitamin A.
It's amazing. And
with your vegan lifestyle, you're keeping your blood sugar low, right? So you're resisting retinopathy, which is the destruction of the vascular system in the eyes. What happens when you have high levels of glucose, right? So if you've
more
been
oxygen in there.
Well, yeah, right. Because if you destroy the vessels that deliver the blood, you can't get oxygen to that tissue, and then the tissue gets hypoxic and it starts to die. So that's one of the mechanisms of how people start to get blurry vision, is because uncontrolled glucose leads to destruction of the vessels that deliver the oxygen to the tissue. Wow. So we're not making this stuff up. So hopefully this episode showed you that, by reducing animal products, you can completely arrest and reverse diabetes. Right?
That's amazing.
And it kind of also shows you that we kind of unintentionally may have developed this disease through that green revolution, right? So, right. I mean, it wasn't something we did on purpose, but
we thought we were doing something good.
You look at the data, that mechanization increased the production, increased the consumption. We were at the highest level in the 80s. Right after the 80s and into the 90s, we get this horrible disease that kind of pokes its head out, and then we just have been going further and further down this path without really looking at the causation. And we presented these studies that say, okay, well, if you're pre-diabetic or if you are eating if you have diabetes, stop eating the animal products, and it goes away.
That's awesome,
right? So
all of this stuff we talked about, the prevention studies Brian was mentioning, the green revolution that Mike was mentioning, Devil in the Milk, the videos that Brian sends to us every single night, and then the Eric Schlosser Fast Food Nation are all going to be in the show notes. Yep. Check it out. Yep. A lot of really cool information. Yep. Do you guys have anything to add to this before we wrap it up?
No, I think we said enough.
Get an Instant Pot. Start making your own beans. Nice. Life changing.
We should get Mike should get endorsed by an Instapot company out there. So if anyone's looking to endorse Montana Mike, let us know.
Moringa Mike.
Moringa Mike. All right, guys. On that note, we are Plant-Based Riot. You are making the choice to live a longer, healthier life. My question to you is, what are you going to be doing with the extra disease-free years on that? All right, plant eaters, tune in to hear more Garden Gab next week. I know I keep saying that. I keep saying that. We're going to change that someday, but Garden Gab it is. All the links will be in the show notes. As for Brian, Mike, and myself, thanks for listening. We are the Plant-Based Riot.